All right, everyone. Welcome back to the eCoreAcademy e-learning platform. My name is AJay, back with yet another eCore Express Java lesson for you all. And this lesson topic for this video is going to be focused on nested loops and conditionals. This is going to be the final lesson of our Unit 4, which is all on loops, this whole unit. We're going to take a look at the structure and function of nested loops and conditionals inside of loops, these two different types of Java code and Java programming. So they're very essential parts. They're a little bit more complicated than our previous loops that we've looked at. And one example that I'm going to be showing you, one variation of loops, is going to include a conditional as well. So I'm going to be showing you those examples on our Eclipse workspace along with some live real-time practice. So let's switch over. All right, everyone, so as you can see on my screen, I am officially on my Eclipse workspace. We're going to be looking at our fourth stop of this Unit 4 loops in our eCore Java Express course. We're going to be focusing on the final lesson, which is going to be conditionals inside of loops and nested loops. I've created these notes on the same exact Eclipse class that we created for our loops. We created all of our loops notes for for loops, while loops, do while loops, and now conditionals inside of loops and nested loops. I created that on the same class, so just put it in at the very bottom. All right, so we're going to take a look at the first example here, the first variation of loops, and that's going to be our conditionals inside of loops. So oftentimes when you have a sequence of code that you want to incorporate within a loop, you can make it a little bit more complex. So sometimes you have some problems that you're faced with, maybe an exercise like I'm giving you, where it might not simply be enough to just create just one loop and create just basic lines of code within. Maybe the code that's within the actual loop, the code that you want to repeat over and over again, might be a little bit more complex. And oftentimes you're given situations where you have to make a conditional. A conditional statement checks for whether or not a statement is true or false, and based off of that, it gives you certain results based off of that. So oftentimes you might have to repeat this conditional check to go on over and over and over again. So we can put conditionals inside of loops so that those conditional checks can repeat over and over and over again for as many times as we want to specify. So in this regard, you can include conditionals inside of loops just as a regular piece of code. So conditionals inside of loops can be used to parse through a series of options to execute that can be repeated multiple times. Like I said, if you want to run a check on information and choose whether or not what result a certain piece of information warrants, then you can utilize a loop and then obviously put that conditional inside of it. So let's take a look at just a basic example of this. I won't go into some more complicated exercises where it's more necessary to do so. I'm just going to give you an example of the structure of this with the basic system.out.println that we've been doing with hello world. It's a lot easier to keep track of things. But in our next few videos, we're going to be showing you the exercises that are going to get a little bit more complicated and really show you the purpose of this. So here we're going to create, we can create any loop that we want, any type. Me personally, I like to create for loops. So let's create a for loop. Like I said, you can create the loops interchangeably. You can use them interchangeably with one another, but I prefer using for loops. I think they're a little bit more organized and professional. So let's say for, we're going to create our brackets here, open and close brackets. So within our for, we have to create our conditional statement, our update, and our initialization. So we're going to say integer. I like to create the integer I. It's a very universal thing to do. That's our integer I here. Is just going to be our initialization of the integer. And we're going to set I equal to 0, semicolon. That's our initialization. Now we're going to do our conditional. The conditional is going to be that I is less than, let's say, 5. And then we'll say here on the outside here, we have to have an update. We'll just increase I by 1. So we'll say I++, so that every time the loop runs, it'll increase I by 1 so we can calculate how many repetitions we have so far. All right, now that we've created our loop, which is what we thought was the hard part, we can just go on and create simple conditional statements. So I'm going to create a simple conditional. I'm going to say if, I'll say a basic condition. I'll say if 0 equals 0, then it can execute this code here, system.out.println. I'll say hello world. So basically all I've done here is I'm saying I'm saying here if 0 equals 0 equals 0. That's a comparison operator. It's saying if the value of 0 is equivalent to the value of 0, then we're going to execute this code. The only reason I did that is we know that it's a true statement. It's going to happen every time, but I'm just showing you the structure of this. So if 0 equals 0, it's going to print out system.out.println hello world. So that was our conditional that we just created. It's an if statement. And then we're going to end this off with our closing bracket for the for loop. Another thing that I just want to point out here, as you can see here, this is our for loop. The for loop's brackets, essentially what's within the for loop are these out exterior brackets. And then what are within for the if statement are these interior brackets, these two smaller interior brackets. Make sure that they're indented and that they're on separate lines, just so that you don't have any errors in your code and it's more organized. All right, so what this should do is this should print out the statement hello world 5 times. Although we just created a conditional, we set 0 equal to 0. I just wanted to show you what the basic structure of this look like. So let's hit play here. And let's see if this printed out correctly. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, it did print out successfully 5 hello world statements in a row. So this is just a basic example of how you can use a conditional within the for loop. In later activities, I'll be showing you how to really utilize the power of the conditional rather than just making a true statement. You can utilize it to parse through information a lot better. All right, now moving on to our second example. Let's delete this code. Clear out our console. All right, now let's move on to the next, the second stop of this lesson. It's going to be our 5th stop of this unit, of this entire unit on loops. It's going to be called nested loops. So nested loops are very similar to conditionals inside of loops, except that instead of putting a conditional inside of loop, you're going to be putting a loop within an actual loop. So this involves a loop within a loop. It can be of the same or different types. So you can have a while loop within a for loop within a for loop, or a do while loop within a for loop, any combination that you would like. There's no errors in that. But oftentimes it is frowned upon to put those different types of loops within each other. It's just not as organized and proper when it comes to Java code, but it won't affect the result. You can use nested loops when there are 2 major parts of the program, one underlying the other. This will repeat the already repeating code. So if you have 2 levels to your whatever exercise or prompt or objective that you're trying to execute with your program, maybe you have something that's more external that needs to repeat, and then within that repeating set or repeating objective, you might need something else that needs to repeat within that problem. I know that sounds a little bit confusing, but if you need something to repeat underneath it, so something subsidiary that repeats, something that repeats within itself, you need a nested loop. So that means 2 parts of the program, one smaller part and one larger part can be both repeating. So like I said, the loop inside is going to be repeated. It's going to be essentially double repeated by the outside loop. And I'm going to be showing you exercises on how to actually utilize this and when to use this. It's a little bit more complicated, not as common to use this. But we'll tackle that in our exercises for this unit. But for now, I'm just going to be showing you a real-time example just to see the actual structure of nested loops. So we'll just create a simple for loop. We'll say integer I equals 0 for initialization. We'll say I is less than 1. This is an example. And we'll say that I++. It's going to increase every time this exterior for loop runs. We'll create our brackets. And then within this for loop, we're going to create another for loop. We're going to say for integer I equals 0. I is less than 5. I++. All right. And then within here, we're going to say our system.out.println statement that we've always been saying, which is hello world. So let me just explain this to you on how this hierarchy actually works. So as you can see here on the outside of our code here, we have a, just 1 second here. Okay. Sorry about that. So as you can see here, I created a local variable I. Whenever you're creating a loop within a loop, you cannot create the same exact variable. We're going to create a new variable. We're going to call it X, just as an example. So we'll say X is less than 5 and X++. So as you can see here, the code executed, but let me explain it first before I explain what the actual output is. So on the outside of our code, we created a simple for loop. We said that we want this for loop to run, the brackets for this outside for loop are here and here. They're on the outsides, outermost. So essentially what this for loop is saying is we want whatever's within this for loop, we want it to run once. We want this for loop to run once. We set the integer I equal to 0. We're going to set it less than 1, and after 1 rep, it's going to increase by 1. And then it's not going to follow this conditional. So this outside for loop is only going to run once. And within that for loop, the code that we're going to be repeating is another for loop. That for loop here is we created a new local integer. It's a local variable called x. Doesn't matter what you call it. It's because we had a duplicate. We already had an I here. We can't create that same variable inside a nested loop. There's an error with the processing. So we created an integer x. We set that equal to 0. We initialized it. Then we said that x must be less than 5, and we're going to increase x by 1 every time this interior for loop runs. So what that's going to do is we're going to say our for loop. What's going to happen is I is equal to 0. I is less than 0 is less than 1. So it's going to run this for loop once. And within that for loop, this other for loop is going to be running 5 different times. It's going to run 5 total repetitions, and it's going to print out hello world. Once those 5 repetitions are done, it's going to come out of the for loop. Then it's going to end this outside for loop as well, and it's going to see, can I run this for loop again? Now it's going to realize that we've already run it once. We can't run it a second time. So all that's going to happen basically is that hello world statement is going to be printed out 5 times. The outside for loop ran once, and within that outside for loop, the interior for loop is going to be running 5 times in that one repetition of the outside for loop. So once the outside for loop runs once, the interior for loop runs 5 times. It comes out of the code, and then we notice that the code is going to be over. It's going to come out of both for loops, and then our code is going to officially execute to our console window. So as you can see here, the console printed out hello world 5 times, just as our interior for loop had told us to do. So that's just a basic example of a nested for loop. A nested loop. I know it's a little bit more confusing, but if you just understand how loops work in general, you can understand more so the structure. We'll get into where you would actually want to utilize nested loops. That's a little bit more complicated. We'll take a look at that in our exercises part of this unit. So stay tuned for these exercises coming up in the YouTube playlist and on our website. All right, everyone, so that'll be it for this lesson. Please make sure to like and subscribe down below if you enjoyed, and make sure to leave a comment if you have any questions. Check out our website at eCoreAcademy.org and all of our socials down in the description box below. This has been AJay Raj, and I'll see you all in the next video.